Hello, everyone. Today, we'd be talking about the different sources of bias that affect a particular sociological research. And at the same time, we talk about the different elements that help us value a particular research method. Now, we'd start off with the sources of bias part first, right? Now, when we speak about the different sources of bias, we would discuss four different categories over here. Number one, we'd speak about bias linked to research, design, and conduct. Number two, we talk about the researcher's values. Number three, we talk about funding being an element that affects a particular sociological research. Number four, we speak about reflexivity. That being the first part, we'd quickly move on towards the second part where we discuss the different elements through which we could figure out the value of a particular research method, or through which we could figure out the credibility of a particular research that is being conducted. And over here, we'd speak about elements such as validity, reliability, objectivity, representativeness, and ethics. Now, without any further ado, let's begin. Now, when we speak about the sources of bias, as we speak about the sources of bias that affect a particular sociological research method, number one, we'd speak about bias that is linked to particular research design and the way we conduct a research, right? The choices that a sociologist makes in designing and conducting their research may lead to bias in their findings, right? Understand this now. The choices that a sociologist makes in designing and conducting their research may lead to bias in their findings. If you're a sociologist, if you're conducting a research, the choices you make in designing your study as well as conducting your study might affect your research, might end up making the findings of your research biased. Number one, now sociologists must choose one or more research methods. And if a sociologist has to conduct a research, he or she needs to collect data. And while collecting data, a sociologist would use a particular research method. It could be a single research method, or there could be multiple research methods that a sociologist uses, right? And every research method, my dear, has its own weaknesses, right? For instance, if we speak about a research being conducted through an interview, if you're a sociologist, you're wanting to conduct a research through an interview, remember it could be interviewer bias, right? Interviewer bias, or the presence of the interviewer, or the characteristics of the interviewer. It could be the interviewer's social class, his or her ethnicity, gender, educational qualification, social background, so on and so forth. So if you are a researcher, you choose to conduct your research through an interviewer, your research might get affected with interviewer bias. Of course, we do need to keep this in mind that different interviewing techniques would affect your interview, or would affect the findings of a research in a different manner. For instance, if we talk about structured interviews, and if we compare the structured interviews with an unstructured interviews, the extent to which interviewer bias could affect the findings would differ. Likewise, if you choose to conduct a research through experiments, right? If you are a researcher, you were to conduct a research through experiments, your research findings would be affected through the Hawthorne effect. What is an Hawthorne effect now? Hawthorne effect, many people know this as social desirability. Others refer to this as demand characteristics. They're all fine, right? They're pretty similar in this context. Now, when we talk about the term Hawthorne effect refers to the behavioral change. Hawthorne effect refers to the behavioral change that the respondents might make, or when a researcher gets to know, or sorry, when a respondent gets to know that a research is being conducted on him or her, or on them, the likelihood of them altering their behavior, right? Researchers conducting a research, the people on whom this research is being conducted, if they get to know that a research is being conducted on them, and they consequently alter their behavior, we refer to that as a Hawthorne effect, right? So number one, we spoke about the choice of research method and how it affects. We spoke about two different examples over here. We started off with interviews, then we went on to experiments. Taking this ahead, if sociologist chooses a non-random sample, right? Now, for this, we all need to remind ourselves about what a random sample is, right? A non-random sample compared to a random sample. A random sample technique is when every individual in the target population gets an equal opportunity of being chosen as a sample, right? If every individual in the target population gets an equal opportunity of being chosen as a sample, we might as well refer to that sampling technique as a random sampling technique, right? Now, this could be done if your target population is small, you could probably write down everyone's names on paper chits, put the chit in a hat, shake, 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 pick up the amount of number that you want to collect your data from. You refer to them as sample. Now, this example that I give you, in this example, you do see how everyone in the target population got an equal opportunity of being chosen as a sample, right? However, there are many other sampling techniques that are referred to as non-random sampling techniques. For instance, this could be volunteer sampling. This could be systematic sampling. This could be opportunity sampling. This could be snowballing, so on and so forth, right? Now, if a sociologist chooses a non-random sampling technique, sampling bias may occur, right? If you are collecting your sample through a non-random sampling technique, that might result in sampling bias. With non-random sampling, some members of the population have less chance than others of being selected. In practice, researchers use their own judgment when selecting non-random samples, right? The researchers' own judgment about who potentially would be the right person to collect data from. This is biasness. This we refer to as sampling biasness, right? They may be more likely to select someone of the population, for example, people like themselves, right, than others. In these cases, the sample will not be representative of the wider population, making generalizability or generalizations difficult. Remember, your sample, my dear, needs to be representative of the target population for your findings to be generalizable. I'll repeat, your sample, when you're choosing your sample from the target population, your sample needs to represent the target population well. If your sample is not representing the target population well, then the findings or the results of the research might not be generalizable to the wider population. We spoke about the second factor. Moving on to the third, sampling bias. Sampling bias is linked to non-response when people in the sample cannot be contacted or refuse to participate. Now, another example of sampling bias could be, now let's just say you wanted to conduct your research through random sample. You put up everyone's names, wrote them down on a chart, put the names in a hat, picked up the number of people that you'd want to collect data from. Let's just say you picked up 20 chits, right? Out of those 20 chits, you go tried contacting them. When you contacted them, when you started contacting them, you realized that, hey, only 14 of them were ready to participate in the research and 6 of them refused to, right? Or there's a possibility that you might not have been able to get in touch with any two of them, any three of them, any of them, right? So sampling bias is also linked to non-response from people in the sample that cannot be contacted or who refuse to participate, right? Systematic bias in a study's findings may occur if, instance, schools without strong equal opportunities policies decline to participate in a study on equality in education. Amazing example. It may also occur if particular groups such as working class men refuse to participate in a research. Now, an example like this, what would happen is whatever the findings that you'd come across, your findings would eventually not have the view of working class men, right? Because they simply chose not to participate in your research, right? Another fourth category over here, sampling bias is also linked to the use of inadequate sampling frame. Now, for this, we need to know what a sampling frame is. When we use the term sampling frame, a sampling frame is the list of the entire of your entire target population, right? If you want to conduct a research on a sociology students who'd be appearing for the paper in May, June 2024 from Karachi, let's just say, the entire list of those participants, right? The entire list of those participants, we refer to them as a sampling frame, right? Or what would be the sampling frame for a particular class? Let's just say if you talk about an AS sociology or an AS psychology class, the class has some 65 students in it, right? Now, the list of their names, the entire list or that you'd come across on the through the attendance register as well, that could be an example of a sampling frame too. So sampling frame is also linked to the use of inadequate sampling frame. For example, one that is incomplete or is out of date, right? So that could be another way through which your the findings of your research could be biased. The next one, when gathering primary data, the researcher's presence could impact on the participants and the findings. This could be seen, for instance, with interview bias, experimenter bias, and observer effect. Now, of course, if if I'm a researcher, I'm conducting a research, I hand over questionnaires, and the questionnaires that I'm handing over, I'm requesting the participants to fill them out in front of me, right? My mere presence, my presence over there, or the researcher's presence over there, might end up affecting the responses that you receive, right? Likewise, the same could happen in an interview, when an interview is being conducted, right? The personality or the characteristics of the interviewer might end up affecting the responses you receive from the interviewee. Now, along with this, the body language, posture, demeanor, eye contact, likability, all of these factors do affect the responses that you receive from an interviewee. So is the case with experimenter bias. We just spoke about Hawthorne effect earlier. And taking it ahead, it could be observer effect too. Observer effect. Now, if the participants, if the people you're conducting a research on, they know that you're conducting a research on them, they know that they're being observed, the likelihood of them altering their behavior, the likelihood of them not actually responding or not actually behaving the way they would behave otherwise is always there, right? So social desirability could be mentioned over here, or demand characteristics. This is what I mentioned a couple of minutes back as well. Taking this ahead, bias can arise from the social desirability effect, which may invalidate the findings. With survey research, the way the survey is administered makes a difference. For example, for this, we need to know what the word survey means. When we use the word survey, we're typically referring to the usage of a questionnaire or an interview. So bias can arise from the social desirability effect, which may invalidate the findings. With survey research, the way the survey is administered makes a difference. For example, self-completion questionnaires reduce the chances of social desirable answers and eliminate interviewer bias. Now, self-completion questionnaires, an example of this, my dear, could be postal questionnaires, or we could talk about you having a questionnaire through a Google form, which you have, which you've sent a link to the participants you want them to participate in the research, and at the same time you've given them an option of keeping their identity anonymous. You've given them an option of not mentioning their name there. So, for example, self-completion questionnaires reduces the chance of social desirable answers and eliminates interviewer bias. Now, I do realize this is pretty simple. I do have an idea. Many of you would be like, hey, I know this. I know that you know this. But remember, all of these points, just note them down somewhere, make notes for yourself somewhere, because what matters over here is these points to occur when you're sitting in the examination hall, right? You knowing it and not being able to put them to the right use isn't of much help to us, right? So remember, even when this is easy, even when you think this is super easy, even when you think you know all of this, make a point that you make notes out of it, and you figure out when and in what type of questions could you possibly use these evaluative points that we just spoke about, right? Now, taking this ahead, number two. So yeah, if the researcher, not number two, if the researcher asks leading questions, now what is a leading question? If it's a questionnaire, or if it's an interview, and the researcher ends up asking a leading question, what's the leading question? When you phrase your question in a manner that you get your desirable answer, right? When you're phrasing your question in a manner that you get your desirable answer, you refer to that as a leading question. As the name suggests, the wordings of the question is leading the respondent or leading the participant to answer back in a particular manner. If the researcher asks leading questions in unstructured interviews, they may impact on participants' answers. Next one could be coding errors. They may be introduced when the researcher processes responses to questionnaire surveys. Now, of course, the idea of operationalizing over here, if you are using if you've designed your question in a manner that it requires interpretation, for that you'd have to operationalize what you mean by a particular like if you want to ask people if they're religious, right? You need to come up with a precise definition of what you think being religious is, and then you need to try to the best of your capacity to ensure that the participants even know what you mean by a particular word, or what you mean by a particular phrase, or what you mean by a particular question. So this was about the bias that is linked to the way you design your research and the way you conduct your research. Taking this ahead, let's talk about the researcher's values. The second element, researchers are likely to study something they consider to be important. Pretty true, right? If you're given an open option to conduct a research on whatever you feel like conducting a research on, the likelihood that you might end up wanting to collect data on, or the likelihood of you wanting to conduct a research on what you think is more important, is always there. So if a researcher chooses a chooses a particular topic according to his or her own interests, that again reflects the researcher's values, like Weber suggested. What they see as important is influenced by the values, their beliefs about right and wrong, good and bad. For example, sociologists' beliefs in gender equality may influence how they view participants' responses during interviews. Now, if you're a sociologist, you're conducting an interview, you receiving responses, the way you or the beliefs that you carry, the beliefs you carry about any particular topic that you're wanting to conduct a research on, would eventually affect the way you're giving meaning to the response that you've received from the person who's responded, right? The respondent, right? So, for example, a sociologist's belief in gender equality may influence how they view participants' responses during the interview. A sociologist's value may lead them to take sides, for example, siding with the underdog, and influence how they analyze interview data. This reminds me of Howard Becker, the American sociologist, how he was very openly advocating that he'd like taking sides with the powerless underdogs. Taking this ahead, another example, many researchers argue that values affect the whole research process, from the choice of topic to the collection and interpretation of data to the final conclusion. Karl Marx saw capitalism as evil and exploitative system, right? You know, I know, Marxism, Karl Marx, born 1818, died 1883. According to Karl Marx, capitalism is an evil and exploitative system, right? We all know this. It's a popular belief that he held. In this case, don't you think the findings that Karl Marx came up with would be affected by his values? Don't you think his findings would be value laden? They would be, right? Now, this is an example from the 19th century. However, we speak about David Harvey, a contemporary sociologist, a British geographer, and a sociologist. Having a look at Harvey. Today, David Harvey shares Marx's vision and values. They direct his research and the questions he asks. So Harvey's questions that he asks in a research, or the researches that he conducts, pretty much reflects his Marxist values. Harvey's values are clear from his words: we need revolutionary politics to replace capitalism with a just and fair society. Now, if you're talking about a sociologist who's very clearly advocating a revolution or revolutionary politics, who's very openly talking about replacing capitalism for us to have a just and fair society, don't you think this reflects his values? Right. So if a sociologist holds beliefs of this particular sort, the likelihood of his or her research being affected by his or her values is always there. Number three, we talk about funding. Funding plays a very crucial role. We have discussed this numerous times earlier as well. When you talk about funding, typically sociologists are funded by different government organizations, different commercial organizations, many charitable institutions, from the industrial sector, from the educational sector, so on and so forth. And these funding organizations, they need to be convinced that whatever you're conducting a research on is of use according to them, right? Now, of course, if you want to conduct a research on something that the funding organization does not consider to be important, why would they want to fund your research. They wouldn't, right? So research in higher education is funded by several sources, including public bodies such as governments, private bodies such as charitable organizations, industrial sector, and commercial organizations. If a public funding body identifies a skill shortage in quantitative methods, it might try to address this deficit by funding more studies based on quantitative method. So if the public funding body, let's just say, if we're speaking about the government over here, if the government thinks there is a shortage of skills when it comes to conducting researches through quantitative methods, they might be more inclined towards funding for these sort of researchers, right? So based on quantitative methods, this might in turn have an impact on what researchers investigate, the types of data they collect, and the research findings, because of course researchers or sociological research workers, they would want their researches to be funded. Researchers are expensive. Taking this ahead, public funding bodies often have research priorities such as housing or digital media. These are just examples we've used over here. The author of the book has used over here. If a researcher applies for funding from one of these bodies, they will tailor their proposal to these priorities. Applying for funding is usually a highly competitive process. Research funds may be allocated according to criteria such as the impact of the work on people, its benefits to society, and its success in bringing about change. This might pressurize sociologists to research topics and produce findings in which the impact is visible in short term. So in a nutshell, we're talking about convincing the particular research organization that the research that you're wanting to conduct on, or the topic that you're wanting to conduct a research on, is actually worth it. Taking this ahead, we initially spoke about the biasness linked to research design and conduct. Number two, we spoke about the researcher's values. Number three, we spoke about funding. Number four, we'd speak about reflexivity. Now, we'd speak about what we discuss what reflexivity is, and then we'd move on to discuss a research example over here. Research examples, rather. Reflexivity. What does the word reflexivity over here mean? Reflection, right? A mirror reflects your image, right? Reflexivity, or in other words, sociologists looking back at themselves, right? A sociologist, while conducting a research or after conducting a research, if a sociologist looks back at himself or herself, at their own values, at their own beliefs, at their own concerns, at their own theoretical assumptions and their positions within a society, and then see how these factors that I just named might have affected their research, right? For instance, if I talk about myself, if I'm conducting a research, if I'm conducting a research that has to do with a lot of countries and a lot of religion, of course, my nationality, my religion would affect my research findings. I mean, it would be unfair and dishonest if I say that it would not. The likelihood of my research findings, some way or the other, intentionally or otherwise, might end up affecting the findings of my researchers. So, if I'm a sociologist, the values that I carry, the beliefs that I hold, the concerns that I have about what's important, what's not, maybe the theoretical assumptions that I support, the position that I hold in a particular society, these factors, amongst other factors, might affect my research procedure, my research process, and my research findings. This process is reflexivity. What is reflexivity? The sociologist looking back at himself or herself to see how the research has been affected by all of these factors. It means reflecting on yourself, how you as a person might have affected the findings you produced and the conclusions you reached. Sociologists can assess their research by being reflexive and also provide lessons for others to apply to their own research. So sociologists can self-scrutinize themselves, self-evaluate themselves. They could assess how the research findings might have affected by factors that are related to themselves, and they could learn lessons out of this, and then they could apply them on their own researches and help others too. Now let's move on and talk about these examples that help us understand reflexivity better. In 1920s, Robert Redfield studied the village of Tepoztlan in Mexico. So, a village in Mexico known as Tepoztlan. He found a warm, generous, and close knit community. Oscar Lewis in 1951 studied the same village. Now, understand this first. We're talking about two different researchers who have studied the same village of in Mexico known as Tepoztlan, right? Oscar Lewis studied the same village 17 years later. He saw a community divided by envy, distrust, and conflict. Do you see the difference over here as to how Redfield saw this community and how Lewis saw this community in the village of Tepoztlan in Mexico, right? Now, one group of one sociologist sees this particular community as being warm, generous, and close-knit, and the other one who conducted a research around 17 years later saw this particular community to have envy, distrust, and conflict. Redfield and Lewis reflected on themselves. We're talking about reflexivity. We're putting reflexivity over here to use, right? Just in case if you want to add this up in a particular answer, or even if you do not, if you're not adding this to in a particular answer, knowing more is always good in sociology. I mean, at least I think if you're studying the subject, it's the subject offers you a lot more than just sitting for the examination. It enhances your understanding of the wider world. So yeah, Redfield and Lewis reflected on themselves and the research to try and explain why their picture of Tipozan was so different. They agreed that the 17 years between the research project could not account for different pictures. So this is an agreement that they hold. According to Redfield, the main reason were personal differences between the investigators, the personal differences between investigators, how these particular researchers, Redfield and Lewis, saw or what their personal view or was about that particular community. Differences in interests and values, which resulted in different questions asked, right? If your interests and values differ, this might result in you asking different questions. And if you're asking different sort of questions, the likelihood of you drawing different conclusions out of it is always there. Redfield clearly liked the people of Tibbetsland. He found them friendly, generous, and welcoming. I found doors were open to me. Lewis did not appear to like them. He wrote that the kindness, generosity, and joy described by Redfield appeared much less often than anger, hate, irritability, jealous, fear, and envy. The studies of Tipozlan indicate the importance of reflexivity, looking at themselves. Now, both of these researchers, Redfield and Lewis, they were able to come up to this conclusion only once they reflected back on their own personal values, their beliefs about the work they did, about their personal interests, and how their interests led to the type of questions that they asked, which consequently led to the responses that they received, which eventually affected the conclusions that they came up with. So Redfield and Lewis recognized what a difference the personal characteristics of the researcher can make to the results of a research. Likewise, another example of reflexivity being put to practice over here, the study that was conducted by Megan Hollis. She used participant observation to study female and ethnic minority police officers in the USA. Interesting. We're talking about Hollis in 2014 using participant observation to study female and ethnic minority police officers in the USA. Remember, a participant observation, you'd be a part of the group that is conducting the research and you would actively participate in the activities they're participating in. As part of her research, she observed a fight on a Saturday night outside a club in the New England city. The police officer she was with accidentally pepper sprayed her. It was an accident. Despite her discomfort, Hollis spent a further 4 hours on patrol with the officer. She had proved herself in a male dominated occupation. As a result, she gained the trust, the respect, and cooperation of the police, right? Now, this research, if you talk about this particular research, Miss Hollis came up with this conclusion that she had proved herself in a male dominated occupation. We're talking about police officers, which resulted in her gaining the trust, respect, and cooperation of the police. She came up with this conclusion only once she reflected back about how her research findings or how a research process was. Looking back on the research, she notes that the officers were increasingly likely to talk to me and accept me as part of the group after this particular incident, the accidentally pepper spray incident. Reflexivity allowed her to assess the quality of the data she collected. Gaining acceptance from the police officers probably indicated to Hollis that her data were more likely to be valid, right? So reflexivity being put to use. We spoke about two different researches, rather three different researches. The first two were about the community in Tepoztlán in Mexico, and the second one, and the third one rather, that was conducted by Hollis. This was in the USA. Taking this ahead, the fifth factor after reflexivity is assessing the value of different research methods. Now, when we talk about assessing the values of different research methods, we have studied different types of researches. We've spoken about different approaches to sociological research methodology. We have spoken about observations. We've spoken about interviews. We've spoken about questionnaires. We've spoken about secondary sources of data, primary sources of data. We've spoken about longitudinal studies. We've spoken about cross-sectional studies. We have spoken about ethnographic studies, so on and so forth. How do we assess if the findings that have been gathered by the usage of these different research methods are actually credible enough? We would be able to figure this out by testing out through these different elements such as validity, reliability, objectivity, representativeness, and ethics. All of these factors, they have been discussed by us at numerous instances while covering this chapter. Well, let's revise them for the last time, and then this unit comes to an end. Validity. Validity concerns whether the method used to gather data actually measures what it is intended to measure, right? So a valid research is validity has to do with the accuracy of the findings of a research. There are different types of validity, from ecological validity to internal validity to construct validity to face validity, so on and so forth. Does it generate data that give a true and accurate description of what they're supposed to describe? If participants open up in an unstructured interview and say what they really mean, for example, they're likely to provide rich and valid data. However, validity may be reduced by the social desirability effect. Once we have revised what validity is, we move on and speak about reliability. A reliable research. What is a reliable research? A research is referred to as a reliable research when the researchers have conducted, or when the researcher has conducted that research on that particular issue more than once and come up with the same conclusion. If you're a researcher, you've conducted a research more than once and you've come up with the same conclusion, we refer to that research as a reliable research. Reliability concerns whether the methods produce the same or consistent results. Like I said, validity, my dear, has to do with the accuracy of the research. Reliability has to do with the consistency of the findings of that particular research. So reliability concerns whether the method produces the same or consistent results the second time round. Official statistics on birth, I'll just keep on highlighting this. Official statistics on birth and death rates are more likely than others to be both reliable and valid. With questionnaires, different researchers can ask the same questions and are likely to get the same results from the same participants. However, reliable results may lack validity, right? Validity and reliability, they do typically go hand in hand, but then again, this is sociology, it's not mathematics. There you need to individually, independently assess a particular situation instead of trying to apply laws like you do in math and physics, because we're dealing about a society, we're talking about a society that comprises of human beings. With qualitative methods such as unstructured interviews and participant observations, it is difficult to check reliability because the study cannot be replicated easily. Now, my dear, I'd want to assume that you're not getting confused between the terms reliability and replicability or replication. Replication is a repetition of a research being conducted, and a research being conducted in the same manner exactly again is replication, right? However, reliability is a step further. A reliable research is when you conduct a research in exactly the same manner once again and you come up with the same findings, right? So over here I spoke about one factor, the repeating part. Over here I spoke about two factors: one, the repeating part, and two, you coming up with the same results. We refer to that research as a reliable research. Number three, we speak about objectivity. An objective research. What is an objective research? An objective research is a research that is free from bias, prejudice, and distortion. Any research that is free from bias, prejudice, and distortion, we typically refer to that research as an objective research. So objectivity concerns whether the methods produced are impartial and unbiased data, right? That are producing impartial and unbiased data, and whether the researchers values intrude. Participant observation, for example, demands a high level of personal involvement. If this reduces objectivity and prevents an impartial view, it is likely to affect the validity of the research as well. So, if you're conducting a research through participant observation, you know for a fact that your personal involvement would be a lot, right? While you're collecting data, this might eventually end up compromising, making you compromise the objectivity that you would probably want to hold, that you potentially want to hold, right? So if your research objectivity, if your research lacks objectivity, the research validity gets affected as well, right? If your research objectivity, if your research procedure lacks objectivity, or while collecting data, if you're biased, right? If your values intrude into a particular research, then your research the finding of your research accuracy would be questionable, right? So participant observation, for example, demands a high level of personal involvement. If this reduces objectivity and prevents an impartial view, it is likely to affect the validity of research observations. Next in line we have over here is representativeness. Representativeness concerns whether the sample is typical of the population that is drawn from, right? Or, like I said earlier, I believe 10 to 15 minutes earlier, while conducting a research, the researcher should try to the best of his or her capacity that the sample that they're choosing to collect their data from is representative of the entire target population, right? If the sample that you're wanting to collect data from is representative of the target population, then only you could claim that the findings of your research might be generalizable to the wider population. So representativeness concerns whether the sample is typical of the population that it is drawn from. It is possible to generalize from a representative sample. Questionnaires based on stratified random sample can form a basis of generalizing. With participant observation, the numbers observed are too small to provide a representative sample. If the data that you've collected is from very few people, then you cannot claim that the findings of your research would actually be representative of the wider target population. Towards the end, we'd speak about ethics. Ethical guidelines play a very important role while conducting a sociological research. So, ethics concern whether the researcher conducted the research and used the methods in ways that comply with ethical guidelines. Ethical guidelines could be, remember, we're talking about ethical guidelines. These are guidelines that are established by various organizations, which are to be followed by sociologists. They're guidelines. Many sociologists do follow them, many don't. So when you talk about these ethical guidelines, number one, informed consent, right? If you're conducting a research, make sure as a researcher that the people you're collecting data from are aware of data being collected on them, right? They should know that data is being collected on them. They should know about the nature, the background, the procedure, the purpose of the research. Number two, confidentiality. What does confidentiality over here mean? If you're conducting a research, make sure that you do not publish the names or anything. You make sure you're not publishing anything that helps anyone trace back the people that you collected that data from. So if you're conducting a research on let's just say sociology students from a particular college, make sure you're not naming the college, make sure you're not naming the students. You don't want anyone to trace them, right? Because not every research findings are are nice enough, or are nice enough to be are nice enough that the people that you collected data from would want to associate themselves with that particular research. Likewise, privacy, do not intrude into anyone's private personal space. If you're collecting data through questionnaires and interviews, make sure you're not stepping into the personal space of participants. If you're collecting data through an observation, make sure you're mindful about the personal space, respect that. Next one, deception. Ideally, do not deceive participants. Do not deceive participants. Do not lie to the participants. Do not deceive them, right? So next one is harm. Do not harm participants. This harm is physical harm as well as psychological harm, right? So it is your ethical responsibility as a researcher to ensure that the participants well-being is seen as your first priority. Do not harm your participants. Do not physically harm them, of course, but at the same time, do not make them go through any sort of psychological distress. A researcher would be seen as unethical if, for example, they used a particular method in a way that caused distress or involved deception to participants. Now, my dear, we were discussing all of this under the heading sources of bias and assessing the values of different methods. This is typically seen as the last topic when it comes to research methodology. Remember, sociology as a subject requires a lot of reading, a lot of writing. If you want to know the subject well, if you want to actually gain knowledge at the same time, while you're preparing for examinations too, make sure you're reading a lot, right? You want to score well, make sure you're writing a lot. So this is pretty much it, and I hope this was helpful. Take good care of yourself, stay happy, healthy, safe, and protected, stay humble, spread positivity, spread smiles, and Allah Hafiz.